There's a number worth sitting with before we say anything else. As of this year, Russia's nuclear stockpile sits at roughly 4,400 to 4,600 warheads, including somewhere around 2,000 designed not for city-destroying strategic strikes, but for the battlefield, tactical weapons, built to be used in a war, not just to end the world. That second category is the one that matters for everything we're about to talk about. Strategic nuclear weapons are the ones everyone grew up fearing, the ones that end civilizations. Tactical weapons are different. They're built into actual warfighting doctrine. And for the first time since the Cold War, a major power is talking about that category not as a last resort, but as a live option on a real battlefield. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It isn't a fringe take. It's published doctrine, repeated military signaling, and a documented pattern that analysts across the political spectrum are now flagging. So let's go through what's actually known, what's contested, and what isn't. Because the honest answer here involves a lot more uncertainty than most YouTube thumbnails want to admit. Let's start with the paper trail, because it's longer than most people realize. In late 2024, Putin signed a revised version of Russia's official nuclear doctrine, the formal document called the Basic Principles, that lays out when the country reserves the right to use nuclear weapons. The update widened the circumstances considerably. Under the older 2020 version, nuclear use was tied to threats against the very existence of the state. The revised version lowered that bar. It now covers aggression against Russia or Belarus, using purely conventional weapons, if that aggression creates what the document calls a critical threat to their sovereignty or territorial integrity. It also added a new trigger: mass launches of aircraft, drones, or missiles crossing into Russian territory, detected by early warning systems, regardless of whether those are nuclear-armed. That's a meaningfully lower threshold than the Cold War standard most people still have in their heads, where nuclear weapons were strictly an end-of-the-world failsafe. Then there's the pattern of behavior layered on top of the doctrine. A study by the Center for Strategic and International Studies counted over 200 instances of Russian officials invoking nuclear weapons specifically in connection with the war in Ukraine since 2022. And this isn't only rhetoric anymore. In May of this year, Russia ran 2 separate nuclear forces exercises within a few weeks of each other. A test launch, followed by a larger drill rehearsing the launch sequence for a nuclear response to a conventional attack. German analysts who tracked the timing noted something worth flagging. Both exercises came shortly after developments on the battlefield that were going badly for Russia. That correlation, bad news on the ground, nuclear signaling shortly after has shown up before in this war, and it's part of why serious analysts treat the doctrine as more than just words on paper. So that's one side of the picture, and it's genuinely concerning. Now here's the other side, because intellectual honesty requires it. U.S. intelligence assessments, specifically the Defense Intelligence Agency, in unclassified testimony, have consistently judged that Russia is very unlikely to actually use nuclear weapons in this conflict unless its leadership believes the regime itself faces an existential threat, not just a battlefield setback. The same assessments note that Russia almost certainly seeks to avoid direct conflict with NATO because it knows it would lose a conventional war against the alliance outright. German analysts who flagged this May's nuclear drills as worth taking seriously also concluded in the same report that the likelihood of those specific drills being a precursor to actual use was low, partly because Russia hadn't repositioned its combat forces in the way you'd expect ahead of a real battlefield deployment. So the honest picture isn't Russia is about to use a nuclear weapon. It's something more unsettling in a different way. The threshold for consideration has been formally and deliberately lowered. The rhetoric and signaling have become a recurring tool of statecraft rather than a one-off threat. And nobody, including the people whose job it is to track this for a living, can tell you with confidence where the real, as opposed to declared, red line actually sits. Ambiguity is, by Russia's own analysts' admission, part of the strategy. Uncertainty is the point. To understand why this matters right now, you need an accurate picture of where the war is, not the picture either side's media wants you to have. As of this year, the war is in its 5th year. There have been repeated rounds of negotiations, trilateral talks between the US, Ukraine, and Russia in places like Abu Dhabi and Geneva, aimed at finding some kind of settlement. Those talks have produced real, concrete results on narrow humanitarian issues. Multiple large prisoner of war exchanges this year alone, including a planned exchange of 1,000 prisoners on each side conducted in stages. That's not nothing. People who would otherwise be in custody indefinitely have gone home. But on the core issues, territory, security guarantees, the fate of contested areas like the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, the talks have repeatedly stalled. Russia's foreign minister has publicly pushed back against what he called over-enthusiastic Western framing of progress. Russia's basic negotiating position remains rooted in demands from the 2022 Istanbul talks, including Ukrainian withdrawal from the Donbass region. Ukraine has been clear it isn't prepared to cede territory, and just this week, Putin rejected limits on long-range missile strikes, a sign, according to analysts who study Russian strategy, that the leadership isn't currently interested in serious limits on the way the war is being fought, on either side. Both sides, meanwhile, have escalated the reach of the war rather than contained it. Ukraine has expanded drone and missile strikes deep into Russian territory, hitting energy infrastructure, military targets, and, this year, forcing Russia to hold its May 9th Victory Day parade, the most symbolically important military event on the Russian calendar, without the usual display of military vehicles, reportedly out of concern about drone strikes on the parade itself. That's a genuinely remarkable fact. Russia altering one of its most important national rituals because of the security situation inside its own capital. On the question of who's winning, that's actually one of the more contested and least settled parts of this story, and you should be skeptical of anyone who tells you it's simple. Different sources frame the trajectory very differently depending on their starting assumptions, and battlefield assessments are notoriously hard to verify independently in real time. What's not contested is that this remains a grinding, costly war on both sides, that Russia continues to hold, and in places extend territorial gains in the east, and that neither side has achieved the kind of decisive breakthrough that would force the other into a quick settlement. Whatever you believe about momentum, decisively won doesn't describe where this stands for either side. Now, to the piece of this that's genuinely unusual by recent historical standards, Germany. Since 2022, when then-Chancellor Olaf Scholz declared what Germans call the Zeitenwende, the turning point, Germany has been on a sustained path toward the largest expansion of its military since the Second World War. Under the current Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, that path has accelerated considerably. The numbers are genuinely large. Germany is on track to spend roughly 650 billion euros on its military over 5 years, more than double the previous 5-year total. The 2026 defense budget alone, at just over 108 billion euros, is the highest in the history of the modern Federal Republic. Plans call for nearly doubling active troop numbers, from around 180,000 to a target of 260,000 by the mid-2030s, plus a 200,000-strong reserve force with a new voluntary registration system for young men that could become compulsory if recruitment falls short. Germany has also approved the purchase of long-range strike systems, including Tomahawk cruise missiles capable of reaching deep into Russian territory, something that would have been politically unthinkable in Berlin a decade ago. Germany's most senior military officer, General Carsten Breuer, has publicly described the current period as the most dangerous he's experienced in over 4 decades of service. Merz has stated plainly that he wants Germany war-ready by 2029, a specific public timeline that itself tells you something about how seriously Berlin is treating the threat assessment internally, whether or not you agree with the assessment. How you read all of this depends heavily on your starting framework, and it's worth presenting both honestly rather than picking one. One view, held by NATO governments and most mainstream European security analysts, treats this as overdue defensive deterrence, a response to a Russia that has already demonstrated willingness to invade a neighbor, that is rearming and modernizing its own nuclear forces, and that Western intelligence assessments describe as the primary military threat to European security for the foreseeable future. Under this view, a militarily weak Germany sitting at the center of Europe is itself a destabilizing fact, an invitation to miscalculation, not a guarantee of peace. A competing view, held by a range of critics on the German and European left, by some historians, and by Russian officials themselves, treats this buildup with much more alarm, pointing to the scale and speed of the increase, the historical weight of German rearmament specifically, the difficult and disputed history of NATO's eastward expansion after the Cold War, and the absence of a clearly articulated diplomatic end state alongside all the military spending. Critics in this camp argue that piling up deterrent capability without an equally serious, equally resourced diplomatic track risks becoming self-fulfilling, that explicit talk of war readiness by 2029, even if intended purely defensively, gets received in Moscow as evidence of hostile intent, regardless of how it's meant. Worth noting on the historical point specifically, since it gets raised a lot, whether Western leaders gave the Soviet Union a binding, formal promise not to expand NATO eastward after German reunification in 1990 is a genuinely disputed question among historians, not a settled fact either way. Declassified documents show informal discussions and assurances were made in that period. Whether they constituted a binding commitment and how far they extended remains contested by serious historians on different sides of the debate. Both the West broke an explicit promise and no such formal promise was ever made are oversimplifications of a messier documentary record. It's a real and legitimate historical debate, not a settled grievance and not a fabricated one. What is true, factually, is that German public opinion on actually fighting remains far more cautious than its government's rhetoric. Recent polling found only around 38% of Germans say they'd definitely or probably fight to defend the country if it came to that. A gap between leadership posture and public appetite that's worth keeping in mind, because it complicates any narrative of a unified march toward confrontation. There's a separate dynamic worth examining: the role of the states physically closest to Russia, the Baltic states in particular, who have consistently been among the most vocal in pushing for a harder line, deeper sanctions, and skepticism toward Russian nuclear threats specifically. Their argument deserves a fair hearing on its own terms, not just as recklessness. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were under Soviet occupation within living memory. Their populations include people who lived through it personally. Their argument is essentially that nuclear threats have functioned, historically, as a tool to deter Western support rather than as a genuine prelude to use, pointing to past Russian red lines, like warnings against supplying Ukraine with certain missile systems that were crossed without nuclear retaliation. From that vantage point, treating every nuclear threat as fully credible isn't caution. It's letting the threat work exactly as intended, handing Moscow a veto over Western policy through rhetoric alone. That's a coherent argument, and serious people hold it. But it carries a real risk worth naming honestly. A track record of bluffs not being called doesn't guarantee the next one is also a bluff, and the people making that bet aren't the only ones who'd bear the consequences if they're wrong. Geography matters enormously in how each side weighs the same uncertainty. Tallinn, Vilnius, and Riga sit on the literal front line if this goes wrong. So, for that matter, does Berlin, Warsaw, and a great deal of the rest of the continent. The disagreement here isn't between the reckless and the careful, it's between different readouts, made under real uncertainty, by people who all have skin in the game, just unevenly distributed skin. Part 5. The Diplomatic Track, Real but Fragile. It would be inaccurate to say diplomacy has collapsed entirely. It hasn't, and that's worth being clear about, because the loudest version of this story tends to flatten that nuance. 3 separate rounds of trilateral talks have happened this year between the US, Ukraine, and Russia. Concrete, verifiable humanitarian progress has come out of them. Thousands of prisoners exchanged on both sides. That's a real, measurable thing actual families have benefited from, not a diplomatic photo opportunity. What hasn't happened is convergence on the issues that would actually end the war: territory, security guarantees, and what a durable settlement looks like once the fighting stops. Talks have repeatedly stalled, restarted, and stalled again. Senior negotiators have, at points, been absent from sessions in ways that read as a downgrading of priority. Russia's chief negotiator described one round as tough but businesslike. Diplomatic language that, read plainly, signals not very much progress at all. The pattern that emerges isn't abandonment of diplomacy, but something arguably more precarious. Diplomacy running in parallel with continued and, in some respects, escalating military activity on both sides, rather than diplomacy actually constraining or slowing that activity. Whether that's sustainable, or whether the military track eventually overtakes the diplomatic one, is genuinely unknown and reasonable. Well-informed people disagree about which direction it's heading. Here's the part that doesn't fit neatly into "Russia is bluffing" or "we're on the brink," because the honest answer sits in an uncomfortable middle. What's actually documented: Russia has formally lowered its declared nuclear threshold, has demonstrated a repeated pattern of nuclear signaling correlated with battlefield setbacks, and maintains roughly 2,000 tactical warheads built specifically for battlefield use rather than city destruction. What's also documented: U.S. and allied intelligence assessments consistently judge actual use as unlikely barring an existential threat to the regime itself, not just a setback in Ukraine. Both of those things are true at once, and the gap between them is exactly where the danger lives, not in certainty that escalation is coming, but in the fact that nobody, including the people whose entire job is tracking this, can rule it out with confidence, and the cost of being wrong in either direction is asymmetric in the worst possible way. Underestimate the risk, and you get catastrophe. Overestimate it, and, at most, you get an unnecessarily cautious foreign policy. Those aren't equivalent mistakes, and that asymmetry is exactly why this deserves more sustained, serious attention than a single news cycle can give it. There's also a structural problem that's easy to miss if you're only following headline to headline. A lot of the Cold War-era infrastructure for managing exactly this kind of crisis, arms control treaties, direct communication channels, agreed rules for managing escalation, has eroded or expired in recent years. New START, the last major treaty capping US and Russian strategic arsenals, expired in February of this year. Both sides have said, for now, that they'll continue informally respecting its limits. But, for now, informally, is a much thinner basis for stability than a binding treaty with verification mechanisms, and it could change without much warning. So where does that leave things, honestly? Not at the edge of imminent nuclear war. The evidence doesn't support that framing, and intelligence assessments from multiple Western agencies consistently say so. But also not in a place where the risk can be waved away as pure theater, because the doctrine has genuinely changed. The rhetoric has become a recurring tool rather than a one-off threat, and the arms control architecture that used to provide some predictability in a crisis like this has been quietly eroding at the exact moment it would matter most. What would meaningfully lower the risk isn't really in dispute among people who study this closely, whatever their other disagreements. sustained, serious diplomatic engagement that survives news cycles and elections rather than starting and stalling every few weeks, renewed arms control frameworks to replace what's expired, and clear-eyed public communication from leaders on every side about where the war actually stands, rather than narratives optimized for domestic politics in the moment. None of that is guaranteed, and reasonable people disagree sharply about who bears more responsibility for the current trajectory. That's a genuinely contested political question, not something this video is going to settle for you. But the underlying physical reality isn't contested. There is no version of a tactical nuclear weapon being used in Europe that stays a regional problem. That part, unlike almost everything else here, isn't really in dispute. If you want to go deeper, the primary documents worth reading directly are Russia's published 2024 Nuclear Doctrine, the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency's Public Threat Assessments, and the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists' Annual Nuclear Notebook on Russian Forces, all linked below, all from people doing this analysis for a living rather than for clicks.